As Lindsay said, my name is Alex and I'm part of the team here at the Life Service, and it is so lovely to be with you here today. And before I start, I'm just going to say a quick prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, please let each and every one of us hear whatever it is that you want us to hear today. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So, as we've already said about 10 times, today is Mother's Day. So it's a day for celebrating mothers. It's a day for giving and receiving cards and chocolates and flowers. But it's also more than that. It's a day that we celebrate all women that have had a positive impact on our lives. And so today, in our talk, we're going to be looking at 2 women that had such a positive impact on each other's lives. So today we're going to be looking at the story of Ruth from the Old Testament. Now, I personally feel a little bit of a connection to her story for quite a few reasons, but 2 of the reasons are that Ruth is one of my middle names. Yes, I have more than one middle name. And secondly, one of the other main characters in the story, her name is Naomi. And Naomi is my daughter Grace's middle name, and she is named after my sister, who actually isn't with us anymore. So I feel really privileged to be doing this talk today. So, Ruth. What do we know about Ruth? The book of Ruth is set in the time of the Judges. And in this section of the Bible, there is a lot of war and a lot of bloodshed, and it's definitely not easy reading. And then we get to the book of Ruth, which is actually a bit of a welcomed break from all of that yuckiness that we have in Judges. And it's more of a love story, really. Not really a romantic love story. It's a story of family love and loyalty. And it's actually really heartwarming. And there's so much that you can learn from this story. So I'm not going to be able to cover everything. So do have a look if you get the chance. So it's even though the story is really heartwarming, it doesn't start off that way. It starts off with a famine in the land of Judah, which is just south of Jerusalem. And due to this famine, a Judean family move from the land of Judah to the land of Moab. However, once in Moab, the father of the family dies, leaving his wife, Naomi, and just their 2 sons. Then these 2 sons marry 2 Moabite women, one named Ruth and one named Orpah. So I'm going to start the talk with a quick question. Can anyone tell me somebody famous that is named after one of these 2 sisters, Ruth and Orpah? Sue just gave a whisper to me. It's not Oprah Winfrey, is it? Now, actually, it is Oprah Winfrey. Actually, if you look at, not that we're going to get the chance, but if you did look at Oprah Winfrey's birth certificate, her name is Orpah, and she was named after Orpah in the story of Ruth. But her parents actually just pronounced her name wrong. So Oprah Winfrey is actually called Orpah. There you go, little fact there for you. So, Naomi, her sons, and her daughters-in-law all lived seemingly happily for 10 years in Moab. But then tragedy strikes again, and then both of the brothers then die. So now Naomi has lost her husband and both her sons. Absolutely unimaginably awful. And so we're left with 3 women connected only by their husbands who were no longer with them. Now Naomi then hears that the famine is over in her homeland of Judah and that she can return home. So she, along with her daughters-in-law, get ready to return to the land of Judah. They set out on their way, but then Naomi has a change of heart. And now I'm going to invite Bob up to do our reading, which is Ruth 1, 8-22.
No, sorry. Yeah, Ruth 1, 8-22. Here we go. So then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We'll go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It's more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she said. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Bob. So poor Naomi, grief upon grief upon grief. She was undeniably and understandably broken. But even in her grief, even in her darkest hour, Naomi showed real love for her daughters-in-law. "Return home, my daughters," said Naomi. "Why would you come with me?" She puts their needs before her own. Naomi was well aware that she was unable to provide for them, so she insists to the daughters-in-law that they should go back to their families. Even though for Naomi, her not having them with her would have made her own life so much harder and, of course, so much lonelier, but she puts their needs before her own. Now, I can't claim to know what it was like for Naomi when she was at her lowest, but I can also identify with Naomi here. In our reading, we saw Naomi at her lowest point. We saw Naomi in her darkness. And I've actually had some pretty dark times in my life too. And I know that when I was at my lowest point, when I was in my darkness, it was my daughter Grace, who was only 3 at the time, that kept me going. She was my reason for living. She needed me, and so I had to put her needs before my darkness. And maybe you can identify with this a little bit too. Maybe there's been days when you felt really low and you've really lacked motivation. You really just can't be bothered. And you just want to hide under your duvet and tell the world to go away. Or maybe tell the world to go away using some other words but with the same meaning. But someone has needed you. So you've had some sort of responsibility. And if it were just down to you, you probably would have just stayed in your pit. But because of your responsibility to somebody else, staying in your pit was not an option. Now, my daughter, Grace, her name means gift from God. And when I gave Grace that name, I actually wasn't a Christian. And I most definitely was not living a Christian life. And at times I blamed God for so much of the mess that I found myself in. But I can tell you that grace really was a gift from God. She saved my life. And I can also tell you that it was during my darkest time that God rescued me and I gave my life to him. God used grace to be my saving grace, and then I was saved by God's grace. And I think maybe it was the same for Naomi too. When Naomi was in her grief, in her darkness, and she felt abandoned by God, and she was really blaming God for the situation that she was in, she put the needs of her daughters-in-law before her darkness, and her situation changed, and she saw God working in her situation, and God blessed Naomi. So when we are in a dark place, go and be a blessing to somebody else. When we take the focus off our darkness and then onto the needs of others, it really can make all the difference. So back to our story of Ruth. Naomi was going to go with her daughters-in-law back to her home of Judah, but she changes her mind and she encourages Ruth and Orpah to go back to their families. And after some persuasion, Orpah makes the really difficult decision and agrees to go back to her family. But Ruth does not. Ruth sees Naomi's pain and she sees the sacrificial love that Naomi is showing her and Orpah. And Ruth does not budge. Ruth very firmly decides to stay with her mother-in-law, and she says one of her most memorable lines: "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die." And it's after hearing these truly beautiful words, Naomi understands that Ruth is completely committed to her and was determined to go with her. So Naomi stops urging Ruth to stay and accepts that they are in this together. Now, then, in one seemingly insignificant sentence, the reading says, "So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem." And I think it's really important that we grasp what this sentence is telling us, because this wasn't just a little stroll around the block or just nipping across to the next town. This would have been a really difficult trek through a desert in the hot sun and would have taken anything from 7 to 10 days, which is no mean feat. And I'm pretty sure that if I had been given a way out of it, like Ruth was, then I would definitely have been more like Orpah and less like Ruth. I would have taken the way out. But Ruth and Naomi, they journey through the desert and they get to Bethlehem. And when they get there, Naomi is recognised by her people. But as Bob showed us in the end of our reading, it's when Naomi expresses her misery. "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Now, names are really significant in the Bible, and they were often prophetic, which means that they would describe the future, or they would be descriptive, so they would say how somebody currently was. And this was why Naomi felt that her name should be changed. The name Naomi means pleasant, and in her grief, Naomi doesn't feel very pleasant at all. Whereas the name Mara means bitter, which sadly Naomi felt actually suited her in her current state. Without her husband and her two sons, Naomi was bitter. She was empty, and this was Naomi at her lowest. But even though her heart was broken, Naomi still showed that motherly love towards Ruth and Orpah, putting their needs first. Sacrificial love. Now, back in Naomi's homeland, Ruth and Naomi now had a bit of a problem. They have made a commitment to one another. But how are this unlikely duo going to survive? Ruth goes out to try and collect food. Now, under Jewish law, there was a practice called gleaning, and Gleaning was a legally enforced entitlement of the poor, and it meant that after the fields had been harvested by the paid workers, the poor were legally allowed and protected to collect anything that had been dropped or missed. So that is what Ruth did. Ruth followed the harvesters and picked up the leftovers. Now, unbeknown to Ruth, it turned out that the field that she decided to glean in was actually a relative of Naomi's. The field belonged to a man called Boaz. And Boaz wasn't just some distant relative. Boaz was a close relative of Naomi's. And we know this because Boaz is described as Naomi's guardian redeemer. Now, this title of guardian redeemer was another Jewish law. Now, under this law, if somebody was financially struggling and due to their circumstances no longer owned their family's land, then the closest male family member who was financially secure was declared the guardian redeemer. But what does that mean? This means that under Jewish law, the guardian redeemer's responsibility was to buy back the family member's land and support the family members. Just like the law of gleaning was created to protect the poor Jewish people that were struggling, the law of guardian redeemer was created to protect the Jewish people that were struggling and also protect their sacred Jewish land. Back to Ruth. Naomi knows that this situation cannot continue forever. Well, it technically could, but that would mean that she and Ruth would just be surviving. And Naomi loved Ruth so very much, and she wanted more for her. She didn't want her to work so incredibly hard for scraps just to survive. She didn't want Ruth to be the lowest of the low within her community. Naomi loved Ruth and didn't want her to just survive. She wanted her to thrive. So Naomi instructs Ruth to get changed and go to Boaz. And she says, uncover his feet and lay down next to him, and then he will tell you what to do. Whoa. Now, I don't know about you, but if a relative of mine told me to go and do that, I would not be very happy one bit. But how does Ruth react? We don't know how she's feeling inside, but on the outside, Ruth is completely obedient. Ruth replies to Naomi, I will do whatever you say. I'm nothing like Ruth. Following this, there are conversations that occur between Ruth and Boaz. And the result of these conversations is that Boaz wants to redeem Ruth and Naomi. So this would mean that he would buy the land of Naomi's husband and both of her sons. Plus, he would then also marry Ruth in order to keep the family's name on the deeds of the land. However, Boaz knew that there was actually another guardian redeemer, a family member that was closer relative than he was. So that meant he had to go and give him first refusal. So the other man said that he was happy to buy the land, but when he found out that Ruth was part of the deal, that was a step too far, and he was really not willing to do that at all. So the man took a step back, meaning that Boaz was now legally able, under Jewish law, to be Ruth and Naomi's guardian redeemer, both buying the land and marrying Ruth and keeping the land in Naomi's family's name. Now, when reading this story, I just kept on wondering how Ruth would have been feeling. But the truth is, it just doesn't say. Did Ruth like Boaz? Was she attracted to him? Did she actually want to marry him? The simple answer is we just don't know. Now, I realise that I am looking at this story through modern Western eyes. The culture of the day was really different. People didn't generally marry for love. Marriages were normally arranged by the bride's father and were done so to maintain the social status of the family and in an attempt to secure the future of the family line. But that doesn't take away from the fact of, regardless of what was normal and what was culturally expected. The women in this story were real women with real feelings, just like you and I, men, you know. And then I am blown away by Ruth's loyalty and obedience to Naomi. She was given a way out. Naomi tried to release Ruth from her responsibility, but Ruth was not going anywhere. And also, when reading the story of Ruth, we never see her complain. Now, there are many times, sometimes many times a day, when I do things that I do not want to do, but I do them because I feel like I should do them or that I have to do them. And I can assure you, I don't always vocalise it, but I have frustration and reluctance, and I quite often do things through gritted teeth and mumbling to myself under my breath. For instance, I have a very wonderful 4-year-old son called Charlie. Now, of course, I love him so very much, and I would do absolutely anything for him. But when it is 2:00 in the morning and he is calling through to me from his room, waking me up and demanding that I go into him to pull the covers over him. Because he claims that he's completely unable to do this, which is complete rubbish. I can assure you that I am most definitely muttering some choice words under my breath. And then, when it's 4:00 in the morning and the same things happen again, oh my goodness, I find it so very hard to hold it together and not explode. But it would appear Ruth, she did not explode. When Naomi asked her to leave her homeland and travel through the desert with her, leaving her family behind, she did so willingly and without complaining. And when she got up every morning to go and pick up scraps to feed Naomi and herself, she did so willingly and without complaining. And when Naomi asked her to go and lay next to a man that she did not know, she trusted Naomi, that Naomi would not put her in any sort of danger. And Ruth did so willingly and without complaining. And then when Naomi asked Ruth to marry Boaz, Ruth does so willingly and without complaining. I think that Ruth is a really special woman indeed. So what was the outcome for Ruth? Right at the very end of the book of Ruth, in 4:13, it says, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son." Now again, another throwaway sentence which can be so easily overlooked, but let's look closer. Ruth was with her first husband, Mahlon, for 10 years. And they had no children. And in those days, there was no such thing as family planning. It was literally up to God when you had a baby. And then Ruth and Boaz get married, and then seemingly right away they have a baby. It says God enabled them to conceive. And one of the main focuses of the whole Bible is to follow the birth line all the way from Adam and Eve, all the way through the generations to Jesus. And it is so interesting that so often within this family line, the couples are unable to have children. And then the Bible tells us that God enables them to have a baby. And something really sad to note, that during that time, in that culture, women who were unable to have children were seen as having a lower status within society. And the fact that over and over again, in the Bible, we see God chooses these women who are seen in society as lesser, and God uses them in such a beautiful way and raises them up to be part of the greatest story in history. Ruth travelling over a week across a desert to end up in a random man's field was not random. It was God's plan. It was God's plan for her to meet Boaz, and that the family line from Adam and Eve to Ruth, from Ruth to King David, and then from King David to another king, the King of Kings, King Jesus. Everything that happened to Ruth happened as part of the greatest story in history. And now I'm going to finish with just 2 points that I'd like us to take. And like I say, there is so much more in the book, and it's only 4 chapters, so do read it. It's wonderful. So the first thing is the characters and the behaviours of the key figures in the story. Now, interestingly, God isn't actually mentioned very much in the book of Ruth, but it's the behaviour and the characters of the characters of the story that point us to God. Firstly, Naomi. With Naomi, it is her love and compassion that stands out. The love that she showed for her husband and her sons, and then because of that love, the inevitable heartbreak at their loss. And then the love and compassion for the daughters-in-law. Even though she was at her lowest point, in her darkest days, she put her needs before her own. And then we have Boaz. With Boaz, it's his compassion and his integrity. Boaz shows Ruth and Naomi huge amounts of compassion and kindness. And as I said, please do read the rest of the story, because Boaz is just such a wonderful man. He offers Ruth many kind words and offers his protection whilst she's gleaning in the field. Furthermore, the level of integrity that Boaz shows is through the roof. Never once does he overstep the mark with his behaviour towards Ruth, even though she was in such a vulnerable position, especially as a foreigner. Over and over again, Boaz does the right thing. Boaz steps up, and seemingly without hesitation and with so much compassion and integrity. And then finally, we have Ruth. With Ruth, it is just her unwavering loyalty and obedience. Ruth shows loyalty and obedience to Naomi over and over and over again. And everything she does so willingly and without complaining. And that brings us to our final point, the relationship between Naomi and Ruth. Now, Naomi was not Ruth's biological mum, but Naomi loved Ruth with a mother's love, and Ruth loved Naomi like a mum. Their relationship is a beautiful example that choosing to love goes deeper than blood. Choosing to love and to put the needs of those around us first is such a beautiful thing. And when others see us loving those around us with that sacrificial love, it points them to Jesus. In John 13:34, it says, "Love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another, and by this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." So whether life is going really well for you at the moment, and I really hope that it is, or if life's a little bit tough and you're finding yourself in a little bit of a dark place, go and be a blessing to someone else. Because when we take the focus of ourselves, off of our darkness, and put our focus on the needs of others and love them, it really does make all the difference. Happy Mother's Day, everyone. Go and be a blessing. Thank you.